Archive Snoop with the second episode of Isabella Messmer and the murder of Buford Armstrong. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe and hit that bell, as I plan to bring you as many episodes as possible as I get them completed. And if you like history like I do, mystery, and a little bit of mayhem, you're going to like the stories I'm going to provide. So please subscribe, and on with the story. So I'm going to do a bit of recap of the first episode to catch you up. We find Isabel Messmer, who they called Two-Gun Girl. She began running away from home at the age of 15, and that was from Elwood, Indiana. She was born in 1914. She seemed to like Washington, D.C. and Miami the best, and that's where she got in most of her trouble. She even admitted herself that she picked up men, so we can assume she was either picking up men to prostitute herself or for robbery purposes, and she always seemed to have a male companion with her, different ones at different times. And the way she seemed to get around when she didn't have money was riding the rails. But she did like her fancy cars, her furs, her fancy clothes, and jewelry, so Isabel was always getting herself in trouble. So we're going to pick Isabel up in 1934 in Coral Gables, Florida. Now at the time, Coral Gables was the second home, first home of rich people, gangsters, you name it. People were flocking to Miami and all the areas surrounding Miami. Isabel evidently liked it because maybe the pickings were good for fleecing men and it was warm. And her MO consisted of bringing men to her room and robbing them of checks, and she would cash those checks. We find her in the newspapers in March of 1934 in Miami, and at this time she's redheaded, and she was released in Miami after 30 days and wasn't charged with the crime of stealing $900, instead was charged with disorderly conduct. Then we catch up back with her in August of 1934 back in Washington, D.C. The story goes that two plainclothes officers had seen Isabella in a blonde wig, and they saw her hair peeking out from the wig. So they came back, they began watching her, and she came back in her boy's clothes, which is the white cap, white shirt, white trousers, and white shoes that we see in this newspaper photo. So they picked her up and arrested her and placed her in a lineup. According to the article, the men weren't able to say that she was the one who robbed them, so she was going to be released. But before she was released, she gave a really great article to the newspaper about her history. She told the newspaper that she was getting an allowance from her parents, which, since we really don't know who her father was, it's possible. She said she liked to travel and she always wanted to work for newspapers, but she didn't think the Elwood newspaper would hire her. She also talked about being kicked out of school, and she said it was just a misunderstanding. She even gave a small story about the happenings in Miami and the $900 check. After being released from jail, she was told to leave D.C. once again.
He can't play golf or tennis or polo or sing a solo or row. He isn't half as handsome as
In September of 1934, Isabel's about 20. She's featured in a newspaper article where it states that she was attacked by 4 black men while she was riding in a coal car, and she got shot in the leg. She ended up in the hospital but was released pretty quickly. I don't think there was ever any arrest made in the situation, so we really don't know what happened.
He's just my Bill, an
2 months later, we find Isabel back in Miami, and they put her in jail, and she was going by the name of Joyce Larimore. They couldn't charge her with anything, so they told her to leave once again. And during the months between November 1934 and April 1935, we really don't know where Isabel was. She doesn't crop up again until April 3rd, 1935, where she's back at home in Elwood, visiting her mother for a brief stay. In the short article, it says she was in Houston, Jersey, where she gets in real trouble in January of 1938. She led the police on a car chase going 80 miles an hour for about 10 miles. She was traveling in a large LaSalle roadster, and she told the officers that her father was a big shot in Washington, D.C., which we really don't know. Was he a manager of a circus, or was he a big shot in DC? She seemed to like DC, so it's entirely possible. We have an image of the 1937 Roadster here, which could have been what she was driving at the time. Once again, Isabella is featured in the newspaper in fancy clothing and smiling. Evidently, during this high-speed chase, she knocked down a police officer, so now she's being charged with molesting men and running down a detective who sought to question her. She gave her age as 21, but in reality, she was about 24 at the time. She was sentenced to the Clinton Reformatory for Women, which at the time was more like a prison farm and had some very radical ideas for the period of time. She pled innocent, but we know she wasn't. I don't have her exact sentence in this article, but in other articles later on it said it was about 7 years. But here's another great picture of Isabel just smiling and posing in the newspaper. Here in my deep purple dreams. Isabel liked to say she was younger than she was, and she got away with it because she was only about 5 feet, 5'1", and she weighed about 90 pounds, so she could look pretty young. And maybe she thought that would get her an easier time of it, but I think the officer was seriously injured. And on January 22nd, 1939, Isabel escaped, and she was featured in the newspaper once again smiling, and she evidently escaped during a dance with another inmate. They called her the Confidence Girl Deluxe and Mail Order Consort of Desperados. The reason for the mail order consort story is that she had previously mailed 2 toy guns to cohorts of John Dillinger and insured them for about $5,000. She didn't get in trouble for that, but whether she knew the men or not, she evidently thought highly of gangsters. And I know she hung around with either lower ranked gangsters, including possibly Whitey Walker back in 1934. Isabella never seemed to be without money, as you saw in the previous photo from the newspaper when she is sentenced to the reformatory. She's wearing a very expensive outfit with furs, and even though she doesn't look very happy, she always seemed to have money, and every time she escaped or was caught, she had money. We lose sight of Isabel for several months until on April 1st, 1939, Buford Armstrong is murdered in Odessa, Texas. So on to the murder of Buford Armstrong. The scene. Odessa at the time was full of oil, roughnecks, cowboys, and of course money. And since she was on the lam, that was probably a good place to go. And Buford Armstrong was a semi-pro baseball player. He was a former pitcher with the House of David team, and he had also done a possibly, I think it was 5-year stint in Huntsville prison for robbery or several robberies. He was also there at the same time that Whitey Walker was. So there's the connection with Whitey Walker. So did Isabel also know Whitey Walker? I'm gonna do a story about Whitey another episode, but on the evening of March 30th in 1939, Messmer was standing on a corner in Odessa, and she was going by the name of Dolores Martinez. So they thought that the woman who had shot Buford Armstrong was possibly a Mexican woman. And they also thought, because of the caliber of the bullet, that the suspect was connected to the Fromm murders, which I will do a story on later. but she had no connection because she was in jail in New Jersey at the time. She may have known about it or known someone who had been involved. And by the way, that is still an unsolved murder here in Texas. So I'll do a story on that later. But they began looking for a Mexican woman. I guess that Isabel had been dumped by her companion because she was hitchhiking, and she ends up in St. Louis, Missouri, and we'll catch up with her there. 6 months after the murder of Buford, Armstrong, we pick up Isabella in St. Louis, Missouri, where she was found at the Statler Hotel cocktail lounge carrying a gun in her handbag. She was small and tiny, and the detective who brought her in couldn't believe she was none other than Isabella Messmer, who had escaped from the New Jersey Women's Reformatory on January 20th, 1939. When confronted with her real identity, she seemed to collapse in tears and admitted to the killing of Buford Armstrong. She said that she had gotten the gun from two Mexicans who, according to her, had murdered Mrs. Fromm and her daughter, which we find out later is not true. With men rushing from New Jersey in order to extradite her, she exclaimed she'd rather die in the Texas electric chair than go back to New Jersey. They just didn't treat her right there. New Jersey waived its claim, and St. Louis dropped the concealed weapons charge, and Isabella returned to Odessa. During the trip back, she said she lied about the gun and getting it from two Mexicans. She thought a connection to the Fromm murders would get her taken back to Texas, which it did, but they didn't connect her to those murders, as of course she was in New Jersey at the time. She eventually signed a confession to murdering Armstrong back in Odessa, and she claimed self defense. Who knew Isabel's life in such a short time was so packed full of stories? In the next episode, we'll have to continue with her trial and her escapes. And yes, I said escapes. Isabel escaped several times, and that's all coming up in the next episode, episode 3, the Isabel finale. Please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so that you know when the next episode is up. I try to build these as I find them, and there's always more to the story, and that's what I love about history, that there's always more to the story if you keep looking in the archives. See you next time.